It's great to be with you all with Young America's Foundation. It's great to be in Texas. It does feel like, it does feel like I'm the only person in this hotel who hasn't beaten Robert Bader O'Rourke in an election, so I feel a little left out. I want to talk to you today about the craziness of gender theory sweeping the country. A craziness that has resulted in men destroying women's sports, in children being mutilated, and urinals being added to girls' bathrooms at schools. Quick side note, I do not understand why anyone chooses to use a urinal. Surely one of the benefits of being a man who finally gets to use a women's bathroom is never having to use a urinal again. They're disgusting things. I'm sure there are people in here who agree with me. You have to be a psychopath to have the perfect excuse to never use a urinal again and want one installed in a bathroom. If you're lucky, you're only going to stand on your own, but who wants to go in and stand with another transgender man with the risk of splashback? Makes no sense. Anyway, urinal rant over, back to the actual speech. Debunking the madness of the transgender mob beyond urinals. So without a doubt, the subject of gender and transgenderism is one of the most important pillars of the culture war. But because it's important, and we're going to dig into that a little bit, it's also important that we speak accurately about it. So what do I mean by the gender mob? I'm not talking about an actual mob of transgender people. I'm not even talking about the diagnosis of transgenderism. No, I'm talking about the ideology that is using transgenderism and transgender people like tools in their mission to destroy and then rebuild society as an impossible leftist utopia. So if we're going to talk about transgenderism from a culture war perspective, it's important that we focus on ideas and their consequences, rather than demonizing transgender people specifically. It's not only immoral to demonize people based on what really should be an irrelevant identity group, it's counterproductive. Yes, some transgender people you see at the forefront of the transgender movement, but not everyone who's transgender agrees with it. Some transgender people are conservative. Some transgender people who have detransitioned are bravely speaking out against it. So let's focus on the ideology and remember that transgender people are real people who are going through something really unimaginably difficult. You don't have to agree with really a single shred of the transgender movement's ridiculous demands to respect the difference between the transgender movement and individual transgender people, many of whom just want to be left alone. So just by being transgender, people aren't posing a danger to society. It's the ideology of transgenderism, pushed by a woke mob hell-bent on rewriting even the most basic principles of civilization, that we need to worry about. So let's talk about them, because they're our true enemy. What are they demanding? They're demanding that we ignore obvious biological reality in that men and women exist and are different. They want us to believe that men and women are interchangeable. All you have to do is identify as one or the other, sometimes different genders on different days, and that's enough. Not only that, people should be celebrated simply for deciding they are something else that day. And if you disagree, you're nothing but a hateful bigot. What they're demanding is that we really turn the world upside down. They are taking gender dysphoria, a real medical condition, and a mental illness, and instead of providing people with support, they want to get the scalpel out and also force the rest of the world to change with them. All while this change from man to woman or woman to man can never be truly achieved. It's about as perverse and uncaring as it can get. When someone is delusional, it is not kind or empathetic and certainly not progressive to embrace and fuel that delusion. It is not kind to tell someone standing on the edge of the cliff that, yes, they can actually fly, or that voices in someone's head are real, or that being morbidly obese is healthy. And it's equally unkind to throw away the truth and tell a man who thinks he's a woman that, yes, he's a real woman. But all of this nonsense that originated in academia has gone way beyond the theoretical, and we are staring into the abyss of a world that really looks to embrace the idea that gender is both real, not real, sorry, and imaginary at the same time. And the consequences are really horrifying. We're talking about hormone treatments that are causing terrible physical and psychological side effects. When they're given to children, they can block puberty, with some of these treatments being essentially chemical castration. We're talking about surgery, double mastectomies, and genital mutilation. We're talking about placing men in women's prisons if they identify as women, resulting in entirely avoidable and entirely predictable rapes. We're talking about boys and men and girls in women's restrooms. We're talking about men being able to compete against women in physical competition. and all as the radical left stands by and cheers with glee. Like all bad policy, and this is really bad policy, it's all built on just a few really powerful lies. What are these lies? Well, the biggest and most obvious lie is that gender doesn't exist, and that men can be women and women can be men. It's not true. Biologically, axiomatically not true. Another lie is that there is no downside to giving in to this ideology. What's the big deal, they ask? Just say the pronouns and shut up. To be able to ask this question, you have to be able to ignore the vulnerable women who should be protected by the state who are being raped in prisons. You have to ignore the destruction of femininity and womanhood, its dilution to nothing more than slapping on some makeup and parading around in a dress on TikTok. You have to ignore the demolition of women's sports, making a mockery of women who have trained every single day of their lives, who are now forced to smile and stand by as a mediocre man comes in and snatches away their gold medal. And you have to ignore the irreversible damage done to transgender people, who are just pawns in the left's latest game. Another lie is that transgender people are facing a unique threat, for which the only solution is to embrace, without question, every demand of the radical left. Do you want a trans kid or a dead kid, is the latest question flying around the internet. Ironically, this is a false binary. They want to believe that unless you do everything they say, everyone's going to die. That's also their strategy for everything else. Ban fossil fuels or everyone's going to die. Ban so-called assault weapons, everyone's going to die. Ban gas stoves, everyone is going to die. In many ways, banning gas stoves upset the most people. But it's all a lie. But that doesn't stop them, of course. Not only will they say that embracing gender theory and all its extreme consequences is the only way to save transgender children, more on that a bit later, they'll point to adults too. You'll be told that transgender people will commit suicide if they don't go under the knife, even though a Swedish study showed that those who received sex-change surgeries had an increased risk for suicide attempts and needing inpatient psychiatric care. You'll also hear about an epidemic of deadly violence targeting transgender people, with the implication being that they died because they were transgender. Every death is indeed tragic, and none of these people should have died, and some of them were killed because they were transgender, but some of them were not. It's also simply irrational to take these deaths and slander anyone who opposes, say, surgery for transgender children, and basically blame them as having created the environment that supposedly caused these deaths. Yes, truly hateful people exist with violence in their hearts. And yes, transgender people should be safe from harm, as we all should. We can agree on these basic principles and still disagree with the ever-expanding demands of the gender theory movement without being held hostage by this emotional ploy. So now it's time for the important part. We all agree that what we're seeing is wrong, but what can we do to change it? How can we fight back? I want us to think about a few areas we can focus on to make a real difference. The first is to focus on children. I don't think surgery or hormone treatments are necessarily a good thing for adults, but there is at least a debate in the context of freedom surrounding people being able to make bad medical decisions for themselves, including surgery. But there is no debate when it comes to children, and children are often the ones being targeted most aggressively by this ideology. They also have the most to lose. Now, the largest proportion of transgender people in the country are 21 years old or younger. According to Gallup, 1.8% of Gen Z identify as transgender. That falls to 1.2% of millennials, and then plummets to 0.2% for Gen X, 0.2% for baby boomers, and 0.3% for anyone born before 1946. There's a ton of debate over why this is. Some are going to point to the fact that society is more accepting of different sexualities and identities, and so people are more comfortable with coming out. Others are going to point to this being a consequence of our culture, and that young people are being encouraged by our society to self-select into this group. Some are saying that young people are being groomed, while other people can't agree on what grooming means in this context. Others are talking about transgenderism as a social contagion. Whatever the reason or reasons, children represent a rapidly growing proportion of the transgender population, and at a younger and younger age. And this is why it's so important for us to focus on these children. It's one thing to have a reasonable debate over, say, a 17-year-old who wants to get a medical procedure. After all, the age of consent in the majority of states is 16. And don't get me started on the fact that you can drive and get blown up for your country or get put in prison as an adult before you can legally drink. If 16-year-olds can't consent to this kind of surgery, which I don't believe they can, then maybe it's time to think about what adulthood means and rethink some of the other arbitrary lines we've drawn elsewhere. But it's quite another thing to suggest that children can reasonably consent to life-changing and irreversible treatments at younger ages. Some parents are embracing their child's so-called gender identity at 3 years old. 3 years old, it's just insane. Especially when we consider that experts are pushing for hormone blockers and other treatments to be given to younger and younger transgender children. So whether it be hormone blockers or surgery or even just a label, we are allowing younger and younger children to make decisions when they can't possibly understand the consequences. If a young child decides they're a dog or a horse or Superman, we don't spring to action and throw them in a kennel, enter them in a horse race, or shoot them into the sky to combat Lex Luthor. We smile and say, that's nice, and we get on with our day. But when it comes to gender dysphoria, or even the slightest level of perceived gender dysphoria, some parents are doing the opposite. It's even more insane, given what progressives have been telling us for decades, that we all exist on a spectrum. But for a crowd of people who insist there are countless genders, they're really obsessed with two. Now, you can't just be masculine female or feminine male anymore. You can't just be a boy who likes to wear dresses or play with dolls. You can't be a girl who likes to wear jeans and play with trucks. Instead, you must have been born in the wrong body. And what makes the fact that more and more parents are enthusiastically throwing themselves down this particular rabbit hole even more horrible, a rabbit hole from which there is no return, is that the vast majority of children grow out of it. Before so-called gender-affirming treatments became the norm, the standard treatment for gender dysphoria, according to the American College of Pediatricians, was watchful waiting and therapy. In other words, wait and see and get therapy if it's still a problem. And guess what? Between 80 and 95% of these children with gender dysphoria grew out of it by the time they hit late adolescence. I'm not saying it was necessarily easy, but they made it through without being sterilized or mutilated. I call that a win. Next, I want us to focus on local solutions. Yes, it's a problem that the national conversation all the way to the top is pushing gender theory on our children. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't work to address that. But the wider we set our sights as individuals, the harder it gets to help people today. And there's so much we can do to help people now. We're seeing it in my home state of Tennessee, where they're pushing a bill to ban healthcare providers from giving minors so-called gender-affirming so-called care. We're seeing it in school meetings where parents are making a stand. And we're seeing it when protesters shut down drag queen story hours, which is a whole other disgusting can of worms we could devote an entire speech to. The fact is that children in our communities are at risk, but only if we remain silent, either through apathy or fear. We must do what's right. It's up to us, those of us still rooted in sanity, to protect these children. And it's up to us to push for local authorities to make it as difficult as possible for this toxic ideology to take hold. No doctor should be allowed to legally cut off a young girl's breasts or a young boy's penis or give them hormone blockers or sterilize them. No teacher should be sharing stories of their sex lives and gender identity journeys. No woman or girl should be exposed to a naked man in locker rooms or bathrooms. No child should be exposed to predatory sexualization as drag culture is crammed down their throats. In the long term, we need to be pushing for change on a national level, but in the short term, the first step, standing up and saying no, is something we all have to do. And finally, I want us to focus on something a little more abstract. I want us to focus on the language we use. If we take a second and think about how we discuss this issue, we're already losing. Sometimes, without even thinking, we're using the left's language, and that's how they win the battle before it's even really started. Here's one example. Think about how conservatives often talk about transgender people. What do we call a biological man who is transgender? A transgender woman. What do we call a biological woman who is transgender? A transgender man. But they're not. A transgender woman is not a woman. A transgender man is not a man. What does transgender man and transgender woman mean? A type of man, a type of woman. So a tall man and a short man, they're both men. Smart woman and AOC are both women. But a transgender man isn't a man. A transgender woman isn't a woman. Why do we call them that? Why don't we call them, say, transgender men, who are the men, transgender women, who are the women? Well, because we're unconsciously adopting the language of the left. And by letting this become part of our language, we've opened the door to the delusion. We've done it with other terms too. Think about how we discuss the medical castration and mutilation of children. We call it gender reassignment surgery, gender affirmation treatment, gender confirmation. These terms accept the premise that your gender can be wrong and that it can be fixed. Neither of these are true. This is exactly how the left handles abortion. They'll avoid saying the word abortion wherever they can because it describes exactly what's being done, killing a baby. Instead, they use terms like reproductive rights and healthcare women need. Abortion isn't healthcare, and surgeries and puberty blockers for children are not treatment. But if we're not careful with every word we use, we risk giving up the premise every single time. It's easy to do, I catch myself doing it all the time, but we need to realize that control of our language is a massive part of how the left controls our culture. So let's start taking that back too. Because that's something each of us can do, choose our words carefully and accurately. For example, we can stop saying transgender man or woman, say a biological man who is transgender, or a biological woman with gender dysphoria, or a man who believes he's a woman. It's not transphobic to acknowledge biological reality. In fact, nothing I've said today is transphobic. Leftists are going to be outraged if any of them bother to watch this and say that everything I've said is transphobic, but again, think about what that word really means. Transphobic means an irrational fear of transgender people. I'm not irrationally fearful of transgender people. I'm not fearful of transgender people at all. I began this speech calling for empathy, not hate or fear. I respect transgender people as individual human beings who are, to varying degrees, suffering. And their suffering has been hijacked and spread by a dangerous, woke political movement that sees them as nothing more than the latest victim group to be abused and then discarded in their pursuit of power. This should be a call to action for every single one of us, regardless of politics. It's not transphobic to fight to protect the most vulnerable in our society, vulnerable men, women, and children, from the perverted clutches of a radical political movement that would happily set fire to basic norms just to get what they want. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to taking any of your questions.